Tonight we're in Warrington. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Ken Clarke, former Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary, currently the nation's longest-serving MP and a regular contributor from the backbenches. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, a former human rights barrister who stands in for Jeremy Corbyn at Prime Minister's Question Time, Emily Thornberry. Kate Andrews, Associate Director of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Chief leader writer at The Observer and former advisor to Ed Miliband, Sonia Sodha. And a comedian and broadcaster who combines comedy with economics and asks, is anything funny about Brexit? Guess we'll find out. Simon Evans. To our panel, to our audience here, and of course you at home, you know you can argue along using hashtag BBCQT on Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram. Join in the conversation. Let's start with our first question tonight, which comes from Matab Khan.
Should Gavin Williamson be prosecuted for breaching the Official Secrets Act?
Well, this has, of course, been all over the papers and all over the news since Gavin Williamson, now the ex-Defence Secretary, was sacked yesterday.
So I think this point from the gentleman in the front about public interest journalism and when leaks are in the public interest is a really important one. I would actually argue that it is in the public interest to know whether the Prime Minister is considering handing over a contract to help build our 5G network to a company like Huawei, a Chinese company that we know comes under the sphere of influence of the Chinese government.
It obviously says it doesn't.
It obviously says it doesn't, but there are lots of analysts out there who say that, you know, regardless of its ownership structure, there's absolutely no way that this company is going to be taking decisions completely outside of the orbit of the Chinese government. And there are Chinese laws that say that Chinese companies do have an obligation to help with state security. So I think it is in the public interest that we have this debate. I'm not sure why it's an issue for the National Security Council. I think it should be being had out in the open. That said, I don't think Gavin Williamson or whoever leaked this from the Cabinet, someone clearly did, from the National Security Council rather, has covered themselves in glory. I think if you're going to leak something in the public interest, the honourable thing to do actually is to say, I've got a problem with this, resign and take your concerns out in the open. That is the honourable thing to do. That is what honourable politicians have done in the past. We haven't seen honourable behaviour here by our politicians. But I would hate for the politics of this to distract from the real issue, which is, should we have security concerns about a company like Huawei getting a contract to build part of our 5G network? We know countries, our allies like Australia and New Zealand, have taken the decision to ban Huawei from sensitive national infrastructure, and I think that's probably the right decision. The last thing I will say is, taking a step back again from all this, is that it really shows the chaos that has beset Theresa May's government. We've got cabinet ministers leaking with impunity. I think we've got a cabinet that's more interested in running their own leadership bids rather than running the country. You know, the government is in chaos. Any notion of collective cabinet responsibility has completely disintegrated. You can't run a country like that. You can't run a country when you can't trust your cabinet ministers because they're leaking all over the place. It shows that Theresa May's got a massive, massive problem on her hands. She doesn't have the authority to run the country anymore.
In the black top.
I think this is a really interesting debate, and I think there's a slight sideline to this about you mentioned honourable politicians and the profession of being in politics. We obviously have an issue with this particular subject, but when it comes to running campaigns and actually giving the public false information, nobody is held accountable, nobody is punished in any way, there's no legality associated with that, and yet we're expected to allow politicians to run our country having fed us what we discovered to be false information. When is that going to change?
So how does that relate to leaks?
It relates to the issue because we come down so hard on this issue of leaks, but we don't come down very hard on politicians who provide us with false information. The best example, obviously, recently, I don't want to bring it to Brexit, the 350
we're going to get to Brexit
million.
in a minute, I suspect. We'll see how we go, but
as an example,
racing certainty.
But as an example, I think that, you know, when is this going to be addressed, and when are we going to be able to trust the people leading our country?
Lots of questions have come in tonight, so I'm going to move on. Before I do, I just wanted to say that question time comes from Northampton next week, and the week after that will be in Elgin, so call 0330 123 99 88 if you'd like to be in the audience, or you can go to the Question Time website, of course, and follow the instructions there. Our next question tonight from Tom Frame.
If we end up with a customs union, have the politicians failed those who voted to leave the European Union?
Well, I've only ever been on questions.
Since when were you called Sonia?
Sorry,
By all means.
I'm sorry. Put two S's next to each other. Sorry,
there you go.
Go ahead.
Sonia, go on.
So I completely understand why people are frustrated. We spent 3 years talking about Brexit and we don't seem to be any closer to a resolution. So if you're a voter, that's incredibly frustrating. However, there's a really thorny issue at the heart of Brexit, which gets to some of what the arguments that the gentleman in the blue jumper there were making and what Kate was making. The problem is there's no such thing as a clean break from the EU that respects the Good Friday Agreement, that keeps no border on the island of Ireland. Now, that's a really, really important insight that just didn't get talked about enough in the 2016 referendum campaign. The fact is, if we want to maintain no border in Ireland, and all sorts of people, both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, say how important that is to maintaining the Irish peace process. And, you know, the Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement to which Britain has signed up to. You just can't go ripping it up. The problem is, if we crash out with no deal, that is going to have really bad consequences for the Irish border. People like Kate say there are technological solutions that help us magic away the border. Well, they've had 3 years to come up with them. And the fact is, I'm
not sure Kate has said that, others might, but Kate actually hasn't today.
Others might, but people do say there are technological solutions who argue for a clean break, and the fact is no one's come up with them. So if we care about peace in Northern Ireland, we have to grapple with this real difficulty, which is you can't have a clean break from the EU and maintain no border.
So do we have to have a customs union? Because that's what
I think we have to have well, not even a customs union gets you there. You have to have regulatory alignment with the EU. And the problem is, when you get into that sort of territory, we become much more of a rule taker. We lose so much control compared to what we've got as a member of the European Union. So every option that maintains no border on the island of Ireland is really a second best option to membership of the European Union. And that is the fundamental problem at the heart of Brexit. And it's what our politicians weren't upfront with us about back in 2016.
God forbid that we should be going round and round in circles on this panel. So I'm going to move on to our next question. Thank you for those contributions. Sarah Whiteside.
Good evening. Should rape victims be obliged to hand over their mobile phones in order to pursue their alleged assailant?
Now, this has come about, obviously, there's digital consent forms that are being introduced across England and Wales that will give police access to the phones of victims of all crimes, incidentally, but also people who allege rape. And there's been some controversy about this, as I'm sure you all know. Sonia.
I think this is a really difficult issue. I do have massive concerns about women who go to the police to report rape, having to hand over their mobile phone, having its entire contents downloaded onto police servers, and that being there for up to 100 years. Who knows what security the police have, who knows exactly what they're going to be looking through. We already know that there are big problems in this country about how the police go about investigating rape, how we prosecute rape. So, for example, we know that it's getting better, but we know that women, when they go to the police, they're sometimes still met with active disbelief when they go to the police to report a rape. We know there isn't enough professional support for women who go to report rape. And we know that rape is still very underreported because women are rightly scared about the trauma of going through a rape trial. It's an incredibly difficult thing to go through if you speak to victims of rape. And I think anything that makes it more difficult for women to come forward and report crime is really troubling. That said, I absolutely accept that, defendants have a right to a fair trial. And if there is evidence on a mobile phone that's relevant to a rape case, then it's obviously completely right that the police investigate it and that perhaps it gets disclosed to the accused legal team. That doesn't mean, however, women having to hand over, what is in effect, if you download the contents of an average mobile smartphone these days, generates, millions of pages, A4 pages worth of data. And I think women are right to be concerned about their privacy and exactly how this is going to be used. So I think we have to balance a victim's right to privacy against a defendant's right to a fair trial. And we have to find some sort of proportionality. Yes, if there's evidence that's relevant on a phone, police should be able to access it.
Well, of course, they won't know it's relevant unless they look for it.
But they don't have to. We should not be getting into a situation where women are basically downloading the entire contents of the mobile phone forevermore. The result of that will be that more women will be worried about coming forward and reporting rape. It will get underreported, and there will be more rapists that walk free, and that would be a terrible thing for our society.
We haven't got a lot of time left in the programme, but I do want to try and squeeze one more question from Will Oliver.
Why would we trust the Tories to tackle climate change when in 9 years of government they've cut subsidies for renewables, supported the expansion of Heathrow Airport and funded fracking across the whole of Lancashire?
Of course, one fracking site is about 50 miles from here.
Briefly, everybody else. Will, I've got a simple answer to your question. You shouldn't trust the Tories on climate change. David Cameron, in opposition, promised that the Conservatives would be the greenest government ever. And actually, from 2010 to 2015, you did see some pretty good policies around climate change. However, since 2015, since you didn't have the Lib Dems in government to keep the Tories honest, you've seen a dizzying number of U-turns on climate policy. Fracking was one thing that Will mentioned. I can't believe that the day after Parliament declared a climate emergency, we're still talking about whether we should frack in this country. Of course we shouldn't. Frack gas, the emissions it gives off, is worse than burning coal. There's been U-turns on the zero carbon home standard, on investment in carbon capture storage. The UK is now on track to miss its next set of legally binding targets on carbon reduction. This is not a government that's committed to climate change. It will sacrifice climate change policies on the altar of austerity and a bonfire of the regulations. We're not going to crack this without state intervention. The Tories are not the party to do it.